The moment Shaquille O'Neal stepped through the grand double doors of La Lumiere, no one reacted. Not a single person turned their head. Not a single guest gasped in recognition. Not a single waiter hurried over to greet him with enthusiasm. And there was a reason for that. They didn't recognize him. Not because he was unfamiliar. Shaquille O'Neal was one of the most famous athletes on the planet. But because he wasn't dressed the way they expected a rich man to dress. And at a place like La Lumiere, appearances were everything. The restaurant was the definition of wealth and exclusivity. A place where diamond-clad guests sipped aged wine, where crisp linen napkins were folded with surgical precision, and where the chandeliers above cast golden reflections onto polished marble floors. It was the kind of place where the scent of truffle oil and foie gras lingered in the air, where a single glance at the menu would send most people into a silent panic. And yet, Shaq walked in like it was any other night. No entourage, no reservation, just a simple grey t-shirt, loose sweatpants, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. At 7 feet, 1 inch tall, he was impossible to miss, yet no one connected the dots. And then she saw him. Claudia, one of the restaurant's most senior waitresses, a woman who carried herself with an air of effortless superiority. Her uniform was spotless, her nails manicured, her dark hair pulled into a sleek, no-nonsense bun. She had worked at La Lumiere for years, long enough to know exactly who belonged and who didn't. And to her, the man who had just walked through the doors, he didn't belong. She tilted her head slightly, her perfectly arched eyebrow lifting as she took in his appearance. The oversized t-shirt, the baggy sweatpants, the shoes. Her lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't just casual attire. This was downright disrespectful. Claudia prided herself on her ability to read people in seconds. To her, wealth had a look. And whatever this man was, he wasn't it. With a sigh, she straightened her posture and approached him, her black heels clicking against the floor. As she stopped in front of him, she put on the kind of polite smile that was laced with just a hint of condescension. "Excuse me, sir," she said smoothly, "but I believe the sports bar is down the street." The words hung in the air like a slap. A few nearby diners turned their heads, subtly glancing toward the scene. Shaq simply blinked, his expression unreadable. "Is that so?" he said, his deep voice calm, steady. Claudia nodded, her practiced smile unwavering. "Yes, this is La Lumiere, a fine dining establishment. I believe you may have taken a wrong turn." She expected him to look embarrassed, to mumble an apology and walk right back out the door. But Shaq didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Instead, he let out a soft chuckle. "Well, that's interesting." Claudia's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. "Why's that?" she asked. Shaq's eyes twinkled with something she couldn't quite place. "Because I'm here to eat." His voice was so calm, so sure, that it unsettled her. For a split second, she hesitated. Then she regained her composure. This was her restaurant. This was her territory. And she wasn't about to let some random guy in sweatpants stroll in and lower the standard of La Lumiere. She folded her arms. "Sir, I don't believe this is the type of place you're looking for," she said, tilting her head. "Our cheapest entree is well over $100. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Yes," she continued, her tone deliberately slow, as if speaking to someone who didn't quite understand. "This isn't the kind of place where people casually stop by." Shaq exhaled a soft laugh through his nose, shaking his head slightly. He had seen this kind of thing so many times before. The assumptions, the judgment, the belief that a man's worth could be determined by what he wore. "I think I'll take a table," he said, smiling. Claudia stiffened. She had given him so many chances to take the hint. But if he wanted to embarrass himself, that was his problem. With a sigh, She lifted a hand, gesturing for him to follow. "Fine," she said smoothly. "Right this way." Instead of leading him to one of the prime tables, the ones near the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city skyline, Claudia walked him through the dining area, past the immaculately set tables, past the wealthy patrons sipping their wine, past the soft glow of candlelit elegance. And then, she kept walking, further and further, until finally she reached the worst table in the house, a small, cramped spot right next to the kitchen doors, where the noise of pots clashing and waiters barking orders filled the air. The table was bathed in dim lighting, almost as if the restaurant itself didn't want it to be noticed. Claudia stopped and turned, flashing him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This should be perfect for you." Shaq looked at the table, then back at her, then back at the table. The room was silent now. Guests who had been pretending not to watch were definitely watching now. Shaq nodded slowly. Then, to Claudia's absolute confusion, he smiled. "Perfect," he said. And then, without another word, he pulled out the chair and sat down. Claudia blinked. No hesitation, no anger, no embarrassment. Her fingers curled slightly around the menu in her hand. This wasn't the reaction she expected, but she wasn't done yet. With deliberate slowness, she set the menu in front of him, placing it down with a sharp little thud that made the nearest guests subtly glance over. Then, she leaned forward just slightly. "Would you like me to explain the prices to you?" she asked sweetly. The message behind the words was crystal clear. She wanted him to flinch, to look nervous, to realize that he was out of his depth. Shaq met her gaze, his eyes filled with an almost amused curiosity. He didn't react, didn't even blink. Then, slowly, he reached for the menu, flipping it open. His fingers trailed down the list of gourmet dishes. Then, without missing a beat, he looked back up at her. "I'll have the filet mignon," he said. "Medium rare." Claudia's lips parted slightly. For the first time that evening, she didn't know what to say. Claudia barely managed to keep her professional smile from faltering. She had been so sure that this man, this random guy in sweatpants, would react the way they always do. A nervous chuckle, a quick backpedal, a mumbled, "Actually, never mind." But Shaq? He just ordered the most expensive dish on the menu like it was a cheeseburger at a drive-thru. The confidence in his voice, the steady way he looked at her, it threw her off balance. For the first time that evening, a sliver of doubt crept into her mind. But Claudia wasn't about to lose this battle, not in her restaurant. She straightened her posture, forcing a smirk onto her lips. "Oh," she said, her tone falsely polite. "An excellent choice." She let the words hang in the air for a second before adding, "That will be $350. She said it slowly, deliberately emphasizing every syllable, as if expecting him to realize his mistake at any moment. Shaq simply nodded. "Sounds good." No hesitation, no surprise. No nervous reach for his wallet to double-check if he had enough cash. Claudia blinked. For a moment, she hesitated. But then she decided he was bluffing. This man was just pretending to be comfortable. He would leave the second the bill hit the table. She nodded slightly and turned on her heel, marching off toward the kitchen. And as she walked, she couldn't help but smirk. He had ordered the most expensive item on the menu? Fine. She'd make sure he regretted it. The kitchen was buzzing with energy as Claudia pushed through the double doors, stepping into the warm chaos of chefs shouting orders and flames flickering beneath sizzling pans. She grabbed the nearest server, Jake, a younger waiter who had been quietly watching the situation unfold from afar. "You won't believe what just happened," she whispered, her voice dripping with amusement. Jake glanced up from his notepad. "What?" "That guy," Claudia said, tilting her head toward the kitchen doors. "The one in the sweatpants. He just ordered the filet mignon." Jake blinked. "So?" Claudia let out a soft chuckle. "So, he's obviously trying to impress someone. Probably a date that never showed up." Jake frowned slightly. "He's alone." Claudia shrugged. "Then he's just showing off. Mark my words, he's going to take 2 bites, realize he can't afford it, and vanish before the check comes." Jake looked unconvinced. Claudia, on the other hand, was certain, and she was going to enjoy watching it all play out. She turned back to the kitchen, snapping her fingers at one of the chefs. "Filet mignon, medium rare," she said smoothly, "and make it extra perfect. We're about to witness a walk of shame." The chef gave a quick nod and got to work. Claudia leaned against the counter, glancing toward the kitchen doors with a smirk. This was going to be fun. Meanwhile, back at the table, Shaq sat in perfect calmness. He wasn't looking around nervously. He wasn't checking his phone to calculate how much money he had left in his account. He was just sitting there, completely at peace. Occasionally, he glanced around the restaurant, watching the way the other guests carried themselves. A man in a tailored suit swirled his wine glass, deep in conversation about his latest stock market investments. A woman draped in diamonds laughed lightly at something her husband whispered in her ear. And every now and then, someone would steal a glance toward him. Subtle, quick, as if trying to figure out what he was doing here. Shaq simply smiled to himself. He had been in rooms like this before. He had walked into places where status mattered more than anything else, where the real currency wasn't money, but perception. And yet, here he was, unbothered, unshaken, and waiting. Claudia strutted back out onto the floor exactly as the food was being plated, carrying herself with the same perfect confidence she always did. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble, her eyes locked onto Shaq's table as she approached with deliberate slowness. Every movement was calculated, every step designed to make it clear that she was in control. And as she neared the table, she could feel the subtle anticipation in the air. A few nearby guests had their forks halfway to their mouths, pausing their meals just to watch what would happen next. She stopped beside Shaq's table, a polished silver tray in her hands, the filet mignon resting perfectly plated before him. Then, with a tiny smirk, she placed it down with just a bit more force than necessary. The plate clinked against the table. "This is what you ordered," she said, her voice silky smooth but laced with challenge. "I hope you can appreciate it." Shaq looked down at the dish. The filet mignon was beautifully cooked, garnished with sprigs of fresh rosemary, and surrounded by a rich golden brown truffle butter sauce. He picked up his knife and fork. Then he looked back at Claudia and smiled. "Looks amazing," he said, cutting into the steak effortlessly. And then he took a bite. Claudia waited for a flicker of hesitation, waited for a moment of doubt, waited for anything that would give away that he was in over his head. But it never came. Shaq simply chewed, nodded to himself, and let out a quiet, satisfied, "Mmm." Then he cut another piece, and took another bite, and another, and another. Like he hadn't just ordered the most expensive item on the menu, like he hadn't just been treated like an outsider, like he had been coming here for years. Claudia's fingers twitched slightly around the tray. Something about this wasn't right, but she refused to show it. She forced a tight-lipped smile. "I'll check in on you later," she said, voice syrupy sweet. Then she turned and walked away, her mind racing. This was not how the night was supposed to go. She had wanted to make him feel small. Instead, It was her who felt unsettled. And she hated it. She had to do something. He had to leave before the check came. Because if he didn't, that meant she had been wrong. And Claudia never liked being wrong. Claudia stood near the service counter, watching Shaq like a hawk. Something about him bothered her. Not because he had done anything wrong. He had been polite, calm, and respectful the entire time. But that was the problem. He wasn't reacting the way people usually did when she put them in their place. She had seen it 100 times before. People coming into La Lumière, thinking they could afford luxury, only to crumble under the weight of the menu prices. Most people tried to laugh it off when they realized they had walked into a place far beyond their budget. Some made awkward excuses. Others pretended they were just here to check out the menu before slipping away, humiliated. But Shaq, he was just eating, calmly, comfortably, like he belonged. Claudia couldn't stand it. She needed to shake him. She turned to Jake, the young waiter she had spoken to earlier, and gestured toward Shaq's table. "You see that?" she said, keeping her voice low. Jake hesitated. "See what?" Claudia rolled her eyes. "He's pretending. He's trying to act like he belongs here." Jake frowned slightly. "Or maybe he just does." Claudia let out a dry laugh. "Oh, please. He walked in here looking like he just rolled out of a gym locker." She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "He's stalling. He's gonna bolt before the check comes." Jake glanced toward Shaq, who was still calmly cutting into his steak, seemingly unaware of the tension brewing around him. Jake wasn't so sure. But Claudia, she was certain. She turned away, thinking fast. If Shaq wasn't going to break on his own, she'd push him. A few minutes later, Claudia strode back to his table, this time with purpose. She wanted an audience. She wanted every guest nearby to hear what she was about to say. She approached with the same poised elegance she always carried, stopping just beside his table with a smile that wasn't really a smile. "How's everything tasting?" she asked, her voice sweet but sharp. Shaq glanced up at her, dabbing the corner of his mouth with his napkin. "It's fantastic," he said. "One of the best steaks I've had." His voice was genuine. Claudia forced a tight smile. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. Then, tilting her head slightly, she added, just loud enough for nearby diners to hear, "And will that be cash or card?" The question hit the air like a brick. The guests at the nearest tables froze, forks hovering mid-air. A few subtle gasps whispered through the room. Jake, standing near the service counter, winced. Everyone knew you never asked that in a place like this. At La Lumière, payment was always handled discreetly, at the end of the meal. Asking someone mid-dinner if they could afford their meal. It was an insult, a challenge, a way of telling someone they didn't belong. Claudia expected one of three things to happen. 1, he'd look embarrassed, mumble something about stepping outside for a call, and disappear forever. 2, he'd argue, flustered, trying to prove himself. 3, he'd admit he made a mistake, ask for a smaller dish, or simply get up and leave. But Shaq didn't do any of those things. He just smiled, a slow, amused, completely unshaken smile. Then he leaned back in his chair slightly, tilting his head up at her. "That's an interesting question," he said, his deep voice smooth. Claudia blinked. That wasn't the reaction she was expecting. Shaq picked up his glass of water, took a slow sip, then set it back down. "I mean," he continued, locking eyes with her, "I don't remember anyone else being asked that question in the middle of their meal." A ripple of unease spread through the guests nearby. Claudia's posture stiffened, but she didn't back down. She doubled down. "Well," she said, her voice sickly sweet, Not everyone makes us wonder if they can pay. This time, the air dropped a few degrees. One table over, an older woman audibly gasped. Lisa, the young businesswoman sitting nearby, narrowed her eyes. Jake, watching from across the room, clenched his jaw. But Shaq? Shaq stayed perfectly still. For a moment, he just stared at Claudia, his expression unreadable. Then finally, he let out a soft chuckle. "You know," he said, voice slow, measured, "I've been to a lot of restaurants." He tapped his fingers against the table once. "This is the first time I've ever been asked that." Claudia crossed her arms, her fake politeness starting to crack. "Well," she said, forcing another tight smile, "there's a first time for everything, isn't there?" Shaq nodded slightly. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket. For a split second, Claudia thought she had won. That he was going to pull out his wallet, fumble around for a card, try to pay early just to save himself from embarrassment. Instead, he pulled out his phone, and then, with zero hesitation, he made a single call. A few guests exchanged glances. Claudia furrowed her brows slightly, watching as he spoke calmly into the receiver. A few seconds later, he hung up, placed the phone on the table, and looked back up at her. "You're about to find out exactly how I'll be paying," he said. Claudia's smirk twitched. "What does that mean?" she asked. Shaq just smiled. And then, before she could say another word, the restaurant doors swung open. A sharply dressed man in a tailored black suit walked in, his presence commanding the attention of the entire room. Mr. Thompson, the general manager of La Lumière. And the moment his eyes landed on Shaq, his face drained of all color. The entire energy of the restaurant shifted. Guests who had been casually watching now fully turned their heads. Mr. Thompson practically sprinted toward the table, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Claudia stiffened, confused. Why was the manager rushing over to him? Before she could process what was happening, Mr. Thompson reached Shaq's table and bowed slightly. "Mr. O'Neill," he said, his voice tight with panic. "We had no idea you were dining with us tonight." Silence. Claudia's stomach plummeted. Wait. She looked at Shaq, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then at Mr. Thompson, then back at Shaq. Then it hit her. Oh my God. She had just insulted the owner of the restaurant. Claudia felt like the air had been punched out of her lungs. Her heart slammed against her ribs as her mind scrambled to process what was happening. She stood frozen, her lips slightly parted, her face draining of color as the weight of her mistake crashed down on her. Shaq wasn't just some random guy in sweatpants. He wasn't a confused guest who had walked into the wrong place. He wasn't someone trying to fake his way into luxury dining. He owned the restaurant. She had just insulted the co-owner of La Lumière, and she had done it in front of an entire room of wealthy, high-status guests. Her hands trembled. She swallowed hard, but her throat was so dry it felt like sandpaper. Mr. Thompson, the general manager, was standing beside Shaq now, his expression one of pure, undiluted panic. "We are deeply sorry for the way you were treated tonight, sir," he said quickly, his voice shaking slightly. Shaq didn't respond right away. He just sat there, calm, silent, watching. And somehow, that was worse. Claudia wanted him to yell. She wanted any kind of reaction. Anything other than this suffocating silence that made her feel like she was shrinking under his gaze. Because in that silence, she realized something terrifying. Shaq hadn't just caught her in a mistake. He had caught the entire restaurant in a mistake. Every single guest who had looked at him funny when he walked in. Every whispered comment about whether or not he belonged here. Every quiet assumption. Every small, silent judgment. He had seen it all. Shaq finally spoke. "Let me ask you something," he said, his deep voice smooth but heavy. Claudia flinched at the sound of it. She forced herself to meet his gaze, but it felt like looking at a storm just before it hit. "Why did you assume I couldn't afford to eat here?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Claudia's lips parted, but no words came out. She knew exactly why, but she couldn't say it, because if she said it, she'd have to admit it. Shaq leaned forward slightly, resting his massive hands on the table. "Was it my clothes?" he asked. Claudia's stomach twisted painfully. "Was it the way I walked in?" Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Was it the fact that I didn't have a reservation?" A long, agonizing pause. Then, Shaq smiled. And somehow that was the worst part. Because it wasn't a nice smile. It was a smile that said, "I already know the answer. You just don't want to say it out loud." Claudia felt exposed in a way she never had before. Her nails dug into her palm, her pulse hammering in her ears. I didn't know who you were," she finally choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. Shaq nodded slowly. "Exactly." Silence stretched between them. Then he leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. "So let's get this straight," he said, his voice still infuriatingly calm. "If I had walked in here wearing a designer suit, you would have treated me differently." Claudia didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. "You know what's funny?" No one dared to speak. "You work at a restaurant called La Lumière," he said, his deep voice rolling through the room. "You know what that means?" Claudia's throat closed up. She knew. Everyone in the restaurant knew. La Lumière, the light. A place that was supposed to welcome everyone. A place that was supposed to be about experience, about excellence, about hospitality. But tonight, it had been a mirror, and the reflection it showed wasn't pretty. Shaq exhaled slowly. Then, with deliberate slowness, he pulled his phone from the table, tapped the screen, and held it up. The entire room froze. Because on that screen was a live stream, and it had been running the entire time. Claudia's stomach dropped. She felt like the floor had just been ripped out from under her. She stared at the screen, her breath hitching. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of viewers. Her face flashed across the reflection of the screen, her condescending voice echoing back at her. Every sarcastic comment, every moment she had looked down on Shaq. It had all been recorded. Lisa, the young businesswoman sitting nearby, let out a low whistle. "Phew," she muttered to her friend. "This is going to be all over the internet in like 5 minutes." Claudia's hand started shaking. She felt hot and cold at the same time. This wasn't just about this room anymore. This was about the entire world seeing her mistake, seeing who she really was when she thought no one important was watching. Shaq finally turned off the live stream and set his phone back on the table. He looked up at Mr. Thompson. "You need to fix this," he said simply. The manager nodded so fast he almost knocked over a water glass. "Yes, sir. Absolutely." Shaq's gaze shifted back to Claudia. And for the first time that night, she broke. I didn't mean..." But Shaq cut her off with a single look, and suddenly, she understood something. It didn't matter what she said now. It didn't matter how she tried to explain herself. The damage was already done. Shaq pushed back his chair and stood up, his massive frame towering over her. The room was completely silent. Then he turned to the rest of the diners. "Enjoy your meal," he said casually, flashing a small grin. And just like that, he walked out. No yelling, no threats, No need to prove anything, because he already had. As the doors swung shut behind him, the entire restaurant seemed to exhale. And Claudia? She finally let out a breath. But she knew. Her career at La Lumière? It was over, and the internet would never let her forget.